Hey there, if you faced early queen attacks and didn't know how to defend against them, then this video is going to help you a lot. But besides trying to punish bad early queen moves, we're also going to study this idea of developing the queen early very deeply, and I'm gonna show you a lot of opening positions, some on which developing the queen early is a bad idea, but other positions where this idea is justified, and we're going to understand the reasons why. So without further ado, let's start with probably the most common way to develop the queen early, which is after the moves e4, e5, and now white going queen to h5 or queen to f3. So here the most common ways to go if white decides to develop the queen is to go queen to h5, because after queen to f3, first of all, white doesn't have any threats. Black can simply develop the knight to f6. And now we see a drawback of developing the queen early, which is that the knight cannot develop to f3. So the queen is taking a natural square for knight, and the knight will normally have to develop to e2, which is a slightly worse position. So queen to h5 is more common if white decides to develop the queen straight away. So now this move has a more concrete idea, which is to capture the pawn on e5, and the queen is on black's side of the board, so this is more aggressive, but on the other hand, black can counterattack the queen more easily. So here the most common way to play against this is to go knight to c6. We're going to cover other alternatives later, but knight to c6 is very natural. We develop a knight and we defend the pawn on e5. And here the logical follow-up is to go bishop to c4. Otherwise, black will simply develop with the knight to f6 and attack the queen. So we see the first drawback of being too aggressive with the queen. So bishop to c4 makes more sense. It has a very concrete idea of going queen takes f7 checkmate. But now we attack the queen in another way by going g6. And if white insists with this idea, queen to f3, again planning to go queen takes f7 checkmate. Here and in the previous position we could go queen to e7 for example, but more natural is to develop a minor piece, so knight to f6 is a more natural way to continue. And strictly speaking, in this position we are not punishing white. White's play was a bit dubious, but the main point is that black already has a very good position. So with correct play the position might be roughly equal, but white definitely lost the potential opening advantage that white should normally have in the opening. White should press for an advantage. In this case, black is perfectly fine. And actually, even former world champion played this line in a game against a very strong grandmaster. But even here, white has to be a bit careful to equalize the position. So here Carlsen continued with the move knight to e2, preventing some knight to d4 ideas. But very often, if white wants to continue attacking, white will continue with a move like d3, planning to go bishop to g5. And in this position, black again could go knight to d4, or even allow the move bishop to g5. Because this pin is actually not a problem for black, black can continue with knight to d4. And now we see another drawback of developing the queen too early in this line, that black is attacking the queen and the pawn on c2. So now it is white the one that has to defend. The queen has to go back to guard the pawn on c2. But even in these positions, if you have doubts, simply play natural moves in the opening, just develop, or simply castle, for example here. Knight to d4 might be in the air later on, or you might even think about developing the bishop by going d6. Black has a perfectly good position here. Or another idea might be to go g4, planning to go g5, attacking the knight, and if the knight moves, go queen takes f7 checkmate. So in this position we might have to be a bit more careful, but we still have the idea of going knight to d4, attacking the queen, and attacking on c2. The queen cannot stay on the f-file, so black is already doing great here. Or another idea in this position that I want to mention that is quite important in the opening, when your opponent plays on one side of the board, in this case white is playing the king side, playing on another side of the board, such as the center or the queen side, is a very useful idea. So here black has the move d5. This is a more advanced idea that you can use for other positions, not only this one, which is to counterattack on the center. And now we see that there's the idea to capture the pawn on g4. So for example, after white takes the pawn on d5, so here we're sacrificing a pawn, but we can easily get the pawn back, attacking the queen. And black is already having a lead in development. One might try queen to g3, putting pressure on the pawn, but now we can continue with this idea of knight to d4. And after queen takes and queen to e7, we force a trade of queens. And now black has an advantage in development even though black is temporarily a pawn down, black can easily get the pawn back. For example, if white defends this pawn on c2, one simple idea is to just take the bishop, and then after knight takes d5, black is already having a clearly better position. So going back to this position, the move queen to h5, strictly speaking, is not a very bad move for white, but black does not have any particular problems. And another more advanced idea is to even allow white to capture the pawn, but get a very quick development in return. In this position, black doesn't have to go for this idea, but this is going to be a very important idea that we'll use for another position. So the idea is to give a pawn and get a quick development in return. So again, here black doesn't have to go for this. Knight to c6 is a great move, but black could even allow white to take the pawn by going knight to f6, attacking the queen, and after queen takes and bishop to e7, black already developed two pieces, and knight to c6 will attack the queen, so black will get another tempo by going knight to c6, and there's also some pressure on the pawn on e4. So here probably the best move is to go knight to c3, developing and overprotecting the pawn e4. And after knight to c6, black attacks the queen, white can go queen to g3. Here the simplest way to go is probably to castle. White castles and defends the pawn on g7. And now d5 will come. Black will develop very quickly. Black already has a lead in development. The king is already castled. So black has excellent compensation for the pawn here. And by the way, let me show you this early queen attack in the Sicilian defense, which is less common because after the move queen to h5, black is attacking the pawn on c5, but black has a very simple way to go, which is the move e6, just protecting the pawn on c5, and now knight to f6 will come. But even here the move knight to f6 attacks the queen and attacks the pawn on e4, so the move queen to h5 in the Sicilian defense is probably even worse than against the move e5. So here white takes the pawn on c5, black can simply capture the pawn back on e4. But even here, black could even sacrifice the pawn by going knight to c6, and after queen takes, go e5, just attacking the queen. Black is going to get a very quick development here. For example, after queen to e3, go knight to f6, and then d5. This is a more advanced way to play against this, but black here has great compensation for the pawn. So this idea of developing the queen on the second move as white is dubious at best, but let's now see what happens when black tries this idea. So after the moves e4 and e5, first of all, if we go knight to f3, black cannot develop the queen to h4 because the knight on f3 is eyeing that square. But let's imagine that we play knight to c3. In this position, the move queen to h4 is actually quite bad because this move doesn't make any sense now that the pawn e4 is protected. So the queen on h4 is not attacking the pawn. So after the move knight to f3, white is developing and attacking. So white is already having a significant advantage here. So we see how this idea that might be dubious as white is actually quite a bad idea if you try it as black. And if we go knight to f3 and black tries queen to f6, again this is not a natural move because now the knight cannot develop to f6. White can try knight to c3 with the idea to go knight to d5, but even if you don't try to punish black straight away, you can simply continue developing by going bishop to c4, for example, even though knight to d5 is very strong. But after bishop to c4, we see that now in this position, black doesn't even have the threat of taking on f2, so white will simply castle and already have a better position. And speaking about developing the queen to h4, I want to cover two other positions that are more complicated. One of them is the move queen to h4 in the king's gambit. So after the moves e4 and e5, if white goes f4, we get the king's gambit. Black has many options here, but one idea is that black can get a pawn after taking on f4. And here the most common idea by white is to go knight to f3, preventing the move queen to h4. But white can even allow this idea by going bishop to c4, simply developing and eyeing the f7 square, and here the move queen to h4 looks a bit more tempting because black gives a check and white cannot attack the queen by going g3 because black will simply capture. First of all, this pawn h2 is pinned, and even if white tries knight to f3, here black has a very nice queen sacrifice after g2, sacrificing the queen, but black simply gets the queen back with interest after capturing the rook. So after the move queen to h4, white's idea is to go king to f1. White even allows black to give a check with the queen, with the idea to attack it back by going knight to f3. So this position is actually quite complicated, but from a practical point of view, black can go wrong very quickly in this position. For example, the move bishop to c5 might look tempting, planning to go queen to f2 checkmate, but after d4, white is actually counter-attacking the bishop. Now knight to f3 will come, there's some pressure on f4, and white also gets this very strong center. So here black has to be a bit careful. For example, d6 has been played in this position, and after knight to f3, just to give an idea, the moves suggested by the engines are queen to f6, which as we saw is not a very natural move, or queen to h6, keeping an eye on this pawn, but on the other hand, the bishop on c1 might be eyeing the queen. After d4, the bishop on c1 is looking at the queen, so this position is objectively good for black, but white's play looks more natural to me. So after bishop to c4, queen to h4 is playable, but black can also decide to play other moves like knight to c6 or knight to f6, simply developing the minor pieces. And just insisting with this idea of allowing black to play queen to h4, besides the move bishop to c4, another way to allow black to play queen to h4 is the move d4, also a very logical move, occupying the center and planning to take the pawn f4, and the idea is that after queen to h4, the king goes to e2. Again, white decides to move the king, but in return, white will play the move knight to f3 and attack back the queen on h4. And again, in this position, black has to be careful. The most common way for strong players to go here is d5, simply giving material back for quick development. But just to show you how black's position can start going wrong, after the move knight to f6, white can simply play knight to f3, and after a move like queen to h5 and knight to c3, white is occupying the center, planning to take on f4, so this position is already looking a bit scary for black. Even though the king on e2 is misplaced, white can sooner or later go king to f2 and even king to g1 if needed. So let's analyze another early queen to h4 by black. Here we have the Scotch game after the moves e4, e5, knight to f3, and knight to c6. d4 leads the game to the Scotch game, and after pawn takes and knight takes, a strange move that is actually quite interesting to play, at least for a few games, is the move queen to h4. So here the move queen to h4 makes more sense because it is attacking this very strong pawn on e4. So if you play the Scotch game as white, you should be familiar with this move, because here there's no easy way to defend the pawn on e4. f3 is not possible because the f2 pawn is pinned, bishop to d3 simply blunders a knight, and after the move knight to c3, which is correct, black's idea is to go bishop to b4, pinning the knight, and again trying to capture the pawn e4. So here white's best play is to give this pawn e4. So now that we know this more advanced idea of sacrificing material for development, we have to implement this idea in this particular position. So here we have to simply develop by going bishop to e2 and then planning to castle. And here black normally takes the pawn e4, otherwise this whole plan doesn't make any sense. And now the idea is to go knight d to b5, attacking this pawn on c7. So black has some trouble defending this very important pawn on c7 because the idea is to fork the king and the rook. So here black normally takes the knight on c3. Black already has to be very careful. Just to show you how black can go wrong in this position, the move bishop to a5, protecting c7 is actually quite bad because white can simply take on c7. Now we see that this bishop is overloaded because after bishop takes, we simply capture the queen. And another bad idea for black is to take the pawn on g2. This might look tempting because black is attacking the rook, but after the move bishop to f3, white defends the rook on h1 and also attacks the queen, so now white is ready to capture on c7 after the queen moves. So here black normally takes on c3 and now we capture with the pawn. The main idea is to keep the pressure on c7, and again black doesn't have a comfortable way to defend on c7. If the queen goes to e5, after f4, the queen cannot keep an eye on c7, so after the queen moves, white will simply capture the pawn on c7. So here black should go king to d8. Now the king is going to be on a central file. So here white can simply castle. So white already has even a better position, more than enough compensation for the pawn, because now white will start attacking the queen, for example by going rook to e1. Black still is underdeveloped with a king on d8, so this position is already quite scary for black. And speaking about the Scotch game, I want to show you another line where black can develop the queen early. In this case, this is actually not a bad idea. So after the move e4 and e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, d4, pawn takes and knight takes. The move bishop to c5 is a very common move in this position. Bishop to e3 is also a very common move, defending knight on d4. And one common way for black here is to go queen to f6. So on one hand, the queen is occupying this very natural developing square for the knight, but on the other hand, black is putting pressure on d4. There might be some ideas to take on b2 because the bishop on c1 is not protecting that square. And here the most common way for white to continue is to go c3, just planning to hold this very strong knight on d4. On one hand this is good, but on the other hand now the knight cannot develop to c3, so black is achieving something here, and the queen in some lines might go to g6, allowing the knight to develop to f6. And even though this is actually main theory, this line is still a bit risky for black, because sooner or later white might have ideas to go f4 and e5, attacking the queen. So with correct play, black should be doing fine, but black still has the risk of getting the queen attacked. And in this line going knight to b5, in case that you are wondering, here it is not that strong because now black can take on e3 first, planning to capture on f2, and after pawn takes, now black has the idea to go back to d8 with the queen. Very often black gives a check on h4, but even after the move queen to d8, in this position black was not forced to go king to d8, and now white got these very weak pawns on the e file. So let's analyze another line where black develops the queen early, and in this case it makes more sense. After the moves e4, c5, knight to f3, here we get a Sicilian defense, and after knight to c6, d4, pawn takes and knight takes. Here a move that has been played, even though it is not the most popular, is the move queen to b6. So here it makes more sense because the queen is developing to a square that is normally not occupied by minor pieces. It also has a very concrete idea of putting pressure on the knight on d4, and it also has a very concrete idea, which is that after the move bishop to e3, which would normally be great because white develops and keeps an eye on the queen on b6, here black has the idea of taking the pawn on b2. So in this position white could defend the knight. Taking on c6 is possible, but in general helping your opponent bring pawns towards the center is not advisable. Playing c3 is actually playable, but as we discussed, now the knight cannot develop to c3. That's why the most common move in this position is to go knight to b3, so white is wasting some time by moving a minor piece twice. But on the other hand, white will develop with tempo by going bishop to e3. For example, after knight to f6, white can go knight to c3, and sooner or later white will go bishop to e3, so black will have to waste time with this queen. The queen will normally go to c7, which is a very common square for the queen in the Sicilian defense. So this is actually quite a playable line for black. And last I want to show you another line in the Sicilian defense where white develops the queen fairly early to the f3 square, but we'll see how in this case it makes more sense. So after the moves e4, c5, knight to f3, d6, d4, takes, knight to f6, knight to c3 and a6. Here we have the Najdorf variation in the Sicilian defense. This is one of the most studied openings in chess. So here white has tried pretty much anything, but the most natural moves here are to develop the bishops. For example, bishop to e3, bishop to c4, bishop to e3, or bishop to g5. But one move that white has tried in this position is the move queen to f3. So white is developing the queen early, but in this case this idea makes a lot more sense because first of all the knight on g1 has already developed, so the knight is very well placed on d4, so the queen is not taking the f3 square for the knight, and white has the idea to castle long after developing the bishop. For example, if black goes g6, white's idea is to go bishop to e3, but white can play the move h3 first. After bishop to g7 and bishop to e3, the move h3 has the idea to stop bishop to g4 ideas, attacking the queen, and also knight to g4 ideas that would attack the bishop. So here black can castle and white can castle long. White doesn't have any particular advantage in this position, but this is a more original position where both sides have their chances. And after the move queen to f3, white's idea is to go h3 sooner or later, so this is a minor drawback that white will have to play the move h3. On the other hand, the move h3 is very often played in the Najdorf variation, and if black tries bishop to g4 straight away, in a way trying to punish white, white can go queen to g3, and then h3 will come with tempo, f3 might also be an idea. So black is not necessarily punishing white here, this is still an option, but white's position is actually quite playable. Okay, so we covered a lot of positions where either white or black develops the queen early. As we saw, in some cases it's actually quite bad, but in some cases, whenever you have some very concrete and sound ideas behind it, it might be possible to play. In any case, when in doubt, just develop your minor pieces or other pieces before the queen. But now you understand this topic a lot more. If you want to improve further at chess, I have a free course that will provide you with a full training plan for that. Thanks a lot for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.